Welcome back to Process Cast with Mark Anderson and Samantha Blake, your go-to podcast for insights into business process management and the technologies transforming the way we work. In this episode, Samantha and Mark dive into a business process you can import into your HEFLO account for free. Click the link in the description to get it.
Okay, so you're ready for this. We're going to dive into the inner workings of something that most of us have done, the business trip. You know, everyone thinks about packing their bags and getting on a plane, but we're actually going to look at all the unseen steps that companies take to handle and organize employee travel.
Yeah, we've got this really detailed internal document, kind of like a roadmap, behind-the-scenes look at how a travel request actually works its way through a company. It's like a step-by-step guide. From that very first idea someone has about needing to travel all the way to when they're submitting their expense reports and getting everything squared away at the end.
It's interesting because if you've never worked in a corporate environment, or maybe you have and you haven't traveled a lot for work, you might not realize all the different players and all the different steps and approvals and things that have to happen before someone can actually get on a plane. So this is going to be a really cool look at that whole process.
And the thing is, you might be surprised at how much thought and how many checks and balances are actually involved. You know, it's not just one person making a decision. It's a whole team effort involving different departments, and they're all laser focused on keeping costs down and making sure everyone's following the rules. It's quite a process.
So our goal today is to break it all down for you in a way that's easy to understand and maybe even a little bit eye-opening, hopefully. We want to kind of pull back the curtain and show you the key stages and the reasons behind them.
Yeah, and I think a good place to start would be right at the beginning, the very first step.
Makes sense. So someone realizes, hey, I need to go on a business trip. What's that first step?
It all starts with the employee, the person who needs to travel. They have to submit a formal travel request. That's what kicks off the entire process.
So it's not just a quick email to their boss saying, hey, I need to go here. There's an actual form or process they need to follow.
Oh, absolutely. This document emphasizes how important it is to have all the details right from the start. You know, everything from the destination, the dates, the purpose of the trip, even an estimate of how much it's going to cost.
And I guess that makes sense, right? Because if you miss something at the beginning, then it can cause delays and headaches later on down the line.
Exactly. It can really slow things down. So this initial form is super important. It's the foundation for everything else.
So the employee fills out the form, clicks submit. What happens next?
The request then goes to their manager, the approver.
So it goes up the chain, and the manager is the one who gets to say yes or no.
Right. But it's not just a rubber stamp. They actually have to review the request carefully. There's a whole review and approval stage.
So what are they looking at? What are they checking?
Well, first they want to make sure that the request has all the necessary information. You know, the who, what, when, where, why, and how much we just talked about. Then they have to make sure that it complies with the company's travel policies.
Right. So are the dates within the allowed time frame? Are the estimated costs reasonable according to their guidelines?
Exactly. And they also have to consider, you know, is this trip really necessary? Does it align with the company's overall objectives and priorities? Is it cost effective?
It's kind of a balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. You have to weigh the need for the trip against the cost and make sure it makes sense from a business perspective.
Okay, so the manager's looking at all these different factors, and then what? They make a decision.
Right. They can either approve the request, which means things move forward to the next stage, or they can reject it.
And what happens if it gets rejected?
Well, usually the manager will provide a reason for the rejection. Maybe some information is missing or the estimated costs are too high. In that case, the employee might be able to revise the request and resubmit it. But sometimes the trip just might not be seen as essential, and in that case, the request is just canceled.
So there's a little bit of back and forth sometimes at that stage.
Right. And it's all designed to make sure that every trip is justified and aligns with the company's goals.
So let's say the manager gives the thumbs up, they approve their request. What's next?
Then we move into the fun part, arranging the actual travel.
Okay, so now we're getting into booking flights, hotels, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And that's where administrative support often steps in.
Okay, so there's a dedicated person or team who handles the booking process.
Right. They take the approved request and start making the arrangements, booking the flights, reserving the hotel rooms, taking care of all those details.
And I imagine they have to shop around a bit to find the best deals, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where quotes come into play. They'll reach out to different airlines, different hotels, maybe even car rental companies if needed, and get quotes to compare prices and services.
Okay, so they're not just booking the first thing they see. They're actually doing their due diligence to find the most cost-effective options.
Exactly. And this can be a pretty significant step because even small differences in price can add up, especially if the company travels a lot.
I bet. So they gather all these quotes, and then what?
Then they usually had to submit those quotes for approval, either to the manager or maybe a designated travel coordinator.
Okay, so there's another layer of review here. Someone is making sure that the chosen travel arrangements are within budget and meet the company's standards.
Right. They might have preferred airlines or hotel chains, for example, or they might have a policy about choosing the cheapest option, even if it means a longer layover or something like that.
So there's a lot of factors that go into it. And then once the quotes are approved, what happens?
Then administrative support goes ahead and finalizes the bookings. They issue the tickets, confirm the reservations, and send all the details to the employee.
Okay, so now the employee knows exactly where they're going when they're leaving, where they're staying, all that good stuff. What's next?
Well, before the trip actually happens, there are often some pre-trip considerations.
Okay, so what kind of things fall under that category?
One of the big ones is providing a travel advance if needed.
So if the employee needs some money up front for expenses during the trip.
Exactly. For meals, local transportation, things like that, the finance department would typically handle this.
And I imagine there's a process for requesting and approving the advance as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They have to make sure it's within company policy and aligns with the estimated costs from the original travel request.
So there's a lot of checks and balances even at this stage.
Right. It's all about being fiscally responsible. And then once the advance is sorted out, there's usually a final check to make sure everything is in order before the employee departs.
Okay, so what does that final check involve?
They just want to make sure that all the travel arrangements are confirmed, the tickets are issued, the hotel reservations are set, the travel advance has been provided if necessary. It's basically a last-minute synchronization point to make sure everything is ready to go.
It makes sense to have that final check just to catch any potential oversights. So the employee is all set, they head off on their trip. What happens while they're away?
Well, while the employee is traveling, things are relatively quiet on the company side. The finance department is probably monitoring the situation, but there's not a whole lot of action happening. They're essentially waiting for the employee to return.
Okay, so the process kind of pauses until the trip is over. So the employee comes back from their business trip, jet-lagged, maybe a little tired of eating out. What's the first step once they're back in the office?
Well, the finance department will usually reach out pretty quickly to request an expense breakdown.
So the employee has to account for all the money they spent during the trip.
Exactly. They'll typically need to provide receipts, invoices, or a detailed list of their expenses, breaking them down into different categories.
So things like airfare, accommodation, meals, transportation incidentals.
Right. And this is where it's really important to keep good records during the trip, because if you don't have the receipts, you might not be able to get reimbursed.
I can imagine that could be a bit of a pain, especially if you've had a busy trip and maybe haven't been as organized as you should have been.
It definitely can be, but it's an essential part of the process because the company needs to have documentation for all the expenses.
So the employee submits their expense report with all the supporting documentation. What happens then?
The finance department takes over again and starts registering the trip expenses.
So they're basically entering all the information into the company's financial system.
Right. And they're also carefully checking everything against the receipts, making sure the amounts match up, that everything is categorized correctly, and that there are no discrepancies.
And if they find any problems or anything that looks suspicious,
then they might have to go back to the employee for clarification or maybe even ask them to resubmit their expense report.
So there's a lot of back and forth to make sure everything is accurate. And once they've registered all the expenses, who looks at them next?
The next stage is evaluating the expenses, and that's typically done by the manager or sometimes by the finance team themselves.
So they're taking a close look at the expenses to make sure everything is legitimate.
Exactly. They're checking for a few things. First, they want to make sure that all the expenses comply with company policy. Are they within the allowed limits for each category? Did the employee follow the guidelines for meals and entertainment?
Right, because companies often have very specific rules about what they'll reimburse and what they won't.
Exactly. And then they're also checking for accuracy. Do the amounts on the receipts match what the employee claimed? Is there anything that seems out of line or questionable?
It sounds like a pretty thorough review process.
It is. And then finally, they're also assessing the overall reasonableness of the expenses.
So do the expenses make sense given the nature of the trip, the destination, the length of stay, things like that?
Right. They want to make sure that the employee wasn't being extravagant or spending unnecessarily.
It's all about being accountable and responsible with company funds.
Exactly. And based on this evaluation, they make a decision. Were the expenses approved or not?
So that's the big moment of truth. And if everything is in order, the expenses are approved. And that's pretty much the end of the process, right?
Right. Once the expenses are approved, the trip is officially considered finished and everything is wrapped up.
But what if there are issues? What if the expenses aren't approved?
Then the process goes back to the registering stage. The finance department would typically work with the employee to resolve any problems, whether it's missing receipts, incorrect amounts, or expenses that fall outside of company policy.
And then once those issues are addressed, the expenses would be reevaluated.
Exactly. So it's an iterative process. It might take a few rounds of back and forth to get everything finalized.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've walked through the entire life cycle of a business trip, from the initial request all the way to the final expense approval. It's quite a journey.
It is. And it involves a lot more steps than most people probably realize.
And it's also interesting to see how many different people are involved in the process. The employee, the manager, administrative, support the finance department. It's a real team effort.
Absolutely. And the document we've been looking at also highlights the key responsibilities of each of those roles.
Right. So just to recap, the employee is the one who initiates the travel request, provides all the necessary information, and ultimately submits their expenses.
Exactly. And then the manager is responsible for reviewing and approving both the initial request and the final expenses.
The finance department handles all the financial aspects, from issuing travel advances to registering expenses and ensuring compliance with company policies.
And administrative support takes care of all the logistics, booking flights, hotels, transportation, whatever is needed.
So it's a well-defined process with clear roles and responsibilities. And I imagine that having this kind of structure in place is really beneficial for companies.
Oh, absolutely. It helps to streamline the workflow, ensure that everything is properly authorized and documented, and maintain control over travel expenses.
And it probably reduces the risk of errors and inconsistencies.
Definitely. And it also promotes transparency and accountability, which are essential in any business environment.
So for you, the listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of what really goes into a business trip. It's not just about packing your bags and hopping on a plane. There's a whole system in place to manage the process from start to finish.
And understanding the system can be really valuable, whether you're an employee who travels frequently or a manager who's responsible for approving travel requests.
Absolutely. And it might even give you some ideas for how to improve your own company's travel policies or processes.
Exactly. And on that note, we'd like to leave you with a final thought. How might understanding this internal process change your own approach to business travel? Or if you're in a position to influence travel policies within your organization, what are some potential areas for improvement that you've identified based on what we've discussed today?
We encourage you to reflect on those questions and see how you can apply this knowledge to your own situation. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thank you for listening to ProcessCast. This episode was brought to you by HEFLO, the BPM platform that empowers businesses to document, automate, and optimize their processes with AI. Experience the intelligence to simplify complex business processes and accelerate your growth with our complete management solution. Visit heflo.com to learn more. Be sure to follow ProcessCast for more insights on business process management, and don't forget to share this episode with your network. Until next time.